So when working in JavaScript, one of the most frequent things you do is work with arrays, some result set. Whether you're building uh, a recipe book application, you might get back an array of recipes, or whether you're building a project management thing, you might get back a result of tasks or projects. Is you want to iterate over those arrays and do something for every element in that array. And the most basic method for doing so is using the forEach method. And today I want to discuss a few different alternatives that I think will result in cleaner code that will be easier to understand at first glance and easier to maintain. So for the first example, I'm going to use this array of presidents. These are the first 5 presidents of the United States. And let's say our first use case is to get a result where it's not an object. We just want to have strings where it's the first name and the last name all in one string. So we could do this with forEach by first defining a variable. And this is a common pattern we see with forEach, which is you have to define a variable before you get to work. So let's say president names, or we'll just do names to keep it shorter. Names is equal to an empty array. And then we'll iterate over the presidents. So for each president. And in here, we'll do something like names dot push. And we're going to add in the president's first name, followed by a space, and then their last name. So we'll copy and paste this, and then if we take a look at names, we have our result. So we can use the forEach for this, and we see this pattern. Define a variable, use forEach, and modify that variable inside the forEach. And so we can accomplish the same thing with map, and we don't have to introduce any other variables. So if we go back to our forEach, we just change this to a map, and then we can actually just return this immediately. So we'll delete all of this and even up to here. We see we get the same result. So we can just immediately return the value that we want. And we see here forEach actually does not return anything, and we have to go back to the names variable. Here we can just get the result out in one call. And so another use case might be is we only want to see the presidents that meet a certain criteria. So let's say we only want to see the presidents that are in the Democratic Republican Party. So we would create a new variable using the forEach method. So we'll do let, we'll say dr presidents. It's going to be an empty array, and then we'll iterate over the presidents using the forEach method. And in here we'll have a condition, so only if the president dot party is equal to this will we then add that to our array. So dr presidents push will add this president to that array. And now we have to take a look at that variable again, and we see all of our presidents are in there. So we can accomplish the same thing using the array filter method. So we'll actually use this as a starting point. Instead of using forEach, we'll do filter, and we'll actually just return either true or false. And that will get us our result. So the way you can think about this is only give me presidents that meet this criteria here. So we'll run this, and we can see again we get 3 results, same as before, and it's the 3 that we expected. And we can see here we did not have to introduce another variable, and we can do it a lot more concisely. And another use case is you might actually want to do both of the things we just did, where you want to map and to filter all in one swoop. So if we consider, we'll set this dr precedence back to an empty array. If we want to get not this object, we want to get, again, just the first and last name in a string. So using the forEach, you would do it the same as before, but instead of pushing on president, you would push on a string. So we'll copy this from the earlier step and paste it in here. And now we look at dr precedence, and we have the result that we expected. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. And we can accomplish the same with array methods a couple different ways. So we'll look at two of them, and I'll discuss which one would be preferred in my opinion. So we can use reduce as one option. So reduce, it will take in two values here, and it also needs a beginning value. So we'll begin with an empty array, and that empty array will get passed into accumulated here, and only if the same criteria is met, the party is what we expect, we'll push it onto accumulated, and then we have to make sure to return accumulated for the next time it gets iterated upon. So if we run this, we see we get the same result, and we're not referencing any outside variable for this. We're just returning out accumulated, which is the end result. And another way we could accomplish the same thing is using flat map, which I think would be a bit cleaner. So we'll use flat map here. We no longer need accumulated, and we can actually just return we'll use a ternary operator here. So if the president party is this thing here, we will then return the string, and if it isn't, we'll return an empty array. And I think we'll actually just delete all this, and we'll delete this parenthesis here. So it looks like something's missing here. President party is equal to this, then return that. Oh, right, another stray parenthesis, just like that. So we get this result here. And the reason this works is flat map will remove any empty arrays from your result. So if instead of doing an empty array here, if you did null, we can see we would have null for the first two. Those are the ones that got removed. We can use an empty array, and flat map will take out empty arrays from our end result. So flat map is a good way to get this accomplished. Yeah, another way that you could have done this, which you might see if you're working in a code base, is a combination of filter and map. And it's certainly a valid way of doing it. However, there's one drawback to it, in that it iterates over your end result 2 times. So if we did presidents.filter, the same thing we saw earlier, and we can straight away do a map on it and return that string, also the thing that we saw earlier, we see we get the same result. However, this goes over the array multiple times. So once the first time, and then for filter, and then the second time for map. And that's okay for this because we have a smaller data set. However, if you're working with large data sets, this could take longer than necessary. So using flat map or reduce would be a better solution in that case. So another use case for forEach is to try to group things together. So if we look at our array here, you might want to create an object where the keys are the name of the party, and the values would be all the presidents that are in that party. So if we can imagine we're trying to achieve something like this here. I just pasted it in, is presidents by party. The key is the party name, and then the value is an array of those presidents in that party. So we'll first implement this with a forEach, and then we'll look at different ways of implementing it. So we could do, as always with the forEach, we have to create a variable. So say presidents, we'll just call it by party. And it's going to be an empty object to start with. And then we iterate over the presidents. And in here, we'll check if there is no entry for the current president's party first. So if the by party, and then here we'll use square brackets, president.party, if this is equal to undefined, we're going to set it to an empty array. So we'll copy this here. It's going to be an empty array. And then we can add on the current president, just like that. And then now if we look at by party, we see that result that we expected. The independent party has 1, Federalist has 1, and Democratic Republican has 3. So we can accomplish the same thing using the reduce method again. So if we change this to reduce, and then we'll introduce that first parameter for accumulated, and then add in our starting value, which is an empty object, and then instead of referencing by party, we'll reference accumulated, and then we'll just have to make sure we return accumulated here. And we see our same result set: 1 in the independent party, 1 in the Federalist, and 3 in the Democratic Republican. And there's even a simpler way to accomplish this, which is the object.groupBy method. So we can pass in the array that we want to iterate over, so presidents, and then a callback, which will give us which group a certain president will go into. So we can just return here the president.party, and we see we get the exact same result. And you can actually do this by any criteria that you want. Maybe you want to group them by their first name. So we can see here there is 1 George, there is 2 James, 1 John, and 1 Thomas. And you could even make that callback function be more complex if you wanted. Maybe if you had their age. We don't have age in this case, but we'll just theoretically write it out. So we'll say if the president age is greater than 50, we would say he's older, and otherwise he's younger. This will fail right now because there is no age property, but then you would get a result of an object where you have older and younger. And using the group by method is very effective, and you can see it's a lot cleaner and much more concise compared to the reduce or even the forEach. And yeah, so another use case that you might want to do is you want to search through an array and find certain results. So if we'll clear this out and we'll work with this array of scores. So we can imagine this is the scores that students got on a test in a class, and we might want to know, did anyone score perfectly? So if we're to use the forEach method, we have to first declare a variable that we're going to modify later. So has perfect score, and we'll set this to false. And so this is part of the challenge with forEach, is figuring out what the correct initial value is. In this case, the correct one would be false, and then we'd have to iterate over the scores and modify that value. So if the score is equal to 100, then we can set that value to be true. Has perfect score is true. and then we don't want to set it to false otherwise, because otherwise we would just set it for the last value effectively, because it would keep overriding. So you have to set it to false to begin with and only modify it to true when we hit a certain condition, and don't set it to false again. So we can run this and we can see it gets set to true. We can accomplish the same thing using the array includes method. And so this is going to be a lot more concise. Includes, and then just include the value that you're looking for. So 100, and you see you just get true. And includes, it works for simple data types like numbers and strings. So, and the reason for that is if you compare numbers, we can get, we can use the equal or the triple equals, double equals to compare them. And the same for strings as well. We can see that yes is equal to yes. This doesn't work for objects though. So if we'll have to do this in parentheses, but if we have an object and compare if it's equal to another object, we're always going to get false. Even if it's empty, even if we have properties in there, each object is actually its completely own space and memory, and it's comparing the memory addresses. So these are not equal to each other. And so to compare objects, we have different methods that we can use. So if we consider, instead of just having this array of scores that we saw earlier with just a bunch of numbers, we'll have an array of students. And each student has a name and a score. And so if we want to accomplish the same thing we did before, we'll set has perfect score to false, and then we'll iterate over the students. Like so. And we'll say if the student dot score this time, if it's equal to 100, then we can change the has perfect score to true. And we can see this works as expected, but we can accomplish the same thing much more concisely using the sum method. So it's a function that expects a function, a callback. So here we'll just return the student dot score is equal to 100, and we get true. So you can see this is much easier to read and think about than these lines here. We're not modifying it, we're not creating a variable and modifying it inside of the loop, and we're also not going over every single element in the array. So for each will go over every single element. Sum and includes as well. It will stop as soon as it finds a matching element. So it would stop here. It wouldn't go over the last element. And you can imagine in this case it doesn't really matter, but if you had a longer array, this could save you a lot of time. And another use case you might want to do is you might want to check, did every student pass? So maybe the minimum score to pass is 60. So using for each, you would first declare a variable, did everyone pass? And so here we'd actually set it to true to begin with. And then we'd iterate over the students. And if we find someone who has a score that's less than the minimum, then we would set that to false. So if the student dot score is less than, let's say 60 was the minimum, we'd set that value to false, and otherwise we don't touch it. So did everyone pass is false. And so we take a look at this. So it's false. So someone didn't pass. And if we take a look over here, we see there's quite a few results actually that don't have a score above 60. And so this, just like always, will go over every result. And we could have stopped as soon as we found one student that failed. And so we can accomplish this with using the every method. So we can do students.every, and then this takes a callback, and we'll return, did the student's score, was it greater than or equal to the minimum score, 60? So we can see this, the inverse of that. And we get false. So you can see this is a lot cleaner and shorter than all these lines of code that we needed above. And we can modify this a bit just to test it. So if the minimum needed to pass was 20, we can see everyone would have passed in that case. And yeah, so oftentimes forEach is the default thing that people reach for when they're working with arrays, but using these other methods like every, sum, reduce, or even the object group by method using flat or filter, these functions are a lot cleaner to implement. You see oftentimes it's less lines of code, and they're a lot easier to reason about in that you don't have to study the code as much compared to the forEach. The forEach, you have to see what variable is created outside of it and how it modifies it. And using these array specific methods, you can just read the method that you're looking at and the condition. It's a lot easier to read and maintain. And for the searching functions like sum, every, there's a few other ones, filter, or not filter, find, or find index. They're very similar. They will stop as soon as they find what they're looking for. So they don't wastefully iterate over the entire array the same way that forEach does. So I hope that you learned something new and that you could use these methods in your projects to write cleaner code that's easier to maintain.